Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta is usually a place of vibrant color, loud cheers, and the sweet smell of breakfast burritos drifting through the cool morning air. But on the final Saturday of the festival, a strange, unnatural weather pattern rolled over the Sandia Mountains, turning the joyful event into a trap. Arthur had been a hot air balloon pilot for over 30 years, and he knew the skies of New Mexico better than his own backyard. His balloon, the Sunburst, was a beautiful mix of bright yellows and deep oranges, a crowd favorite. That morning, as the clock struck 6, the flight directors gave the green light for the mass ascension. Thousands of people watched from the grassy launch field as hundreds of balloons began to inflate, their burners roaring like mechanical dragons in the dark. Arthur checked his gauges, made sure his propane tanks were full, and pulled the blast valve. With a familiar, comforting whoosh of hot air, the Sunburst lifted gently off the grass, rising into the chilly pre-dawn sky alongside a sea of other colorful giants. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. Arthur looked down and saw the thousands of flashing camera lights from the crowd below looking like tiny stars on the ground. But as he passed an altitude of 1,000 feet, the air suddenly turned violently cold. A thick, heavy gray fog swept over the valley in a matter of seconds, moving much too fast for regular weather. It wasn't a normal cloud. It was a dense, suffocating mist that smelled faintly of old river water and wet dirt. Within moments, the ground completely disappeared from view. Arthur looked around, expecting to see the bright envelopes of the other balloons nearby, but they were all gone, swallowed by the gray wall. He reached for his aviation radio to contact the launch field controllers, but the device only emitted a loud, ear-piercing burst of static electricity. The static quickly transformed into a low, rhythmic sound that sounded terribly like a human being breathing heavily right into the microphone. Arthur shivered, rubbing his gloved hands together as the temperature inside the wicker basket continued to drop rapidly toward freezing. Desperate to get above the fog line and find the sun, Arthur pulled the burner cord to blast a long, powerful stream of fire into the balloon's envelope. The burner roared, but the flame that came out was wrong. Instead of a bright, warm orange, the fire was a sickly, pale violet color that shed no warmth at all. Arthur looked up into the interior of his balloon to check the fabric, and his heart skipped a beat. A massive, ink-black shadow was moving across the nylon panels inside the balloon. It wasn't a shadow cast by anything in his basket. It was an independent, shapeless mass that gradually formed the distinct shape of a giant, multi-jointed human hand. The shadow hand crawled slowly down the interior fabric, stretching toward the throat of the balloon where the fire entered. At the same moment, the air around Arthur became so heavy he could barely breathe, and a profound, terrifying silence fell over the sky. There was no wind, no sound of other burners, and no noise from the city below. He was completely isolated in a gray void. As the Sunburst drifted blindly through the mist, another hot air balloon slowly materialized out of the fog, floating on a direct collision course. Arthur quickly grabbed his air horn and blew it loudly to warn the other pilot, but the sound died instantly in the heavy air. As the mystery balloon got closer, Arthur realized it was an ancient, faded model from the early 1970s, its fabric rotted, frayed, and covered in dark patches of mold. The name The Lost Wanderer was barely visible on its side. Arthur held his breath as the two baskets brushed against each other with a soft, scraping sound. He looked across into the stranger's basket, expecting to see a terrified pilot, but the basket was entirely empty. There were no propane tanks, no instruments, and no lines. Yet, suddenly, the ancient burner on the Lost Wanderer erupted with a furious, roaring blue flame all by itself. The intense heat of the blue fire began to melt the fabric of the old balloon, but it didn't fall. Instead, Arthur saw something that made his blood run cold. Inside the empty basket of the ghost balloon, the wicker floor began to creak, bending downward as if an invisible, incredibly heavy weight had just stepped into it from the sky. Arthur scrambled to the opposite side of his own basket, his eyes wide with terror as he watched the empty ghost balloon drift away back into the fog. But the horror was not over. A heavy thud vibrated through the wicker floorboards beneath his own feet. He looked down and gasped as the woven willow branches began to warp. A wet, muddy footprint suddenly pressed into the floor right next to his left boot. There was nobody there, but the footprint was deep, steaming slightly in the freezing air. Then, another footprint appeared a foot away, pointing directly at him. Arthur backed up against the side of the basket, pulling his pocket knife out with trembling fingers, though he knew a knife was useless against an invisible phantom. The phantom footprints continued to walk toward him, slow and deliberate, accompanied by the distinct sound of heavy, wet boots squelching on timber. The invisible entity stopped just inches away from Arthur. He could feel an icy, foul-smelling breath hitting his face, smelling of decay and ancient dust. A cold, heavy pressure clamped down onto his shoulder like a vice, and a raspy, disembodied voice whispered directly into his ear, saying, "We've been waiting for a new pilot." The phantom pressure suddenly dragged Arthur toward the edge of the basket, trying to lift his legs over the side. He fought back with all his strength, kicking and screaming into the empty fog, clinging desperately to the thick burner support ropes. The invisible force was incredibly strong, pulling at his jacket until the fabric began to tear. In a moment of pure survival instinct, Arthur reached out with his free hand and grabbed the manual vent line, the rope used to open the top of the balloon to dump air and descend rapidly. He pulled it with all his weight. The sunburst immediately lost its lift and began to plummet out of the sky like a stone, dropping thousands of feet per minute. The sudden, violent downward acceleration seemed to shock the invisible entity, and the icy grip on Arthur's shoulder vanished. The footprints disappeared from the floor, and the freezing air instantly warmed up. The sunburst crashed hard through the bottom of the fog layer, slamming violently into an empty dirt field several miles away from the festival grounds. The basket tipped over, spilling Arthur onto the dirt. He lay there gasping, bruised and battered, looking up at the sky. The fog was gone, the sun was shining, and hundreds of normal, colorful balloons were floating peacefully in the distance, as if the nightmare had never happened. But when Arthur looked at his jacket, he saw the dusty, faded handprint of a skeletal hand burned into the shoulder fabric, a permanent reminder of the fleet that flies in the mist. The evening night glow is widely considered the most magical part of the balloon fiesta. Instead of flying up into the dark, hundreds of hot air balloons remain safely tethered to the grassy field, standing side by side like a row of giant, glowing lanterns. When the event coordinator counts down over the loudspeakers, every single pilot hits their burner at the exact same moment, illuminating the entire park in a breathtaking flash of synchronized color. Lily had been working as a field volunteer for 3 years, wearing her bright neon vest and using a flashlight to guide families safely through the crowded grid of ropes and wicker baskets. The air was filled with the smell of roasted nuts, popcorn, and the happy chatter of tens of thousands of spectators holding up their phones to take videos. But as the night went on, a strange, biting wind began to blow in from the desert, causing the massive balloons to sway uncomfortably, and a strange, heavy feeling of dread settled over the edge of the festival grounds. It was nearly 9 o'clock, right after the main glow event had finished and the crowds were beginning to slowly drift toward the exit gates. Lily was instructed to walk the western perimeter of the field, an unlit area near the dark desert brush where unauthorized vehicles sometimes tried to park. As she walked further away from the bright stage lights, the happy music faded into the background, replaced by the eerie whistling of the wind through the guide wires. That was when she noticed it. Standing at the very edge of the property line, parked entirely in the dark shadows of a row of large generator trucks, was a massive hot air balloon that looked completely wrong. Lily pulled out her clipboard and flipped through the laminated pages of the official festival schedule, trying to find its registration number, but there was nothing listed for this specific location. It was completely unauthorized, hidden away from the main display as if it didn't want to be seen by the thousands of tourists. The balloon was entirely, absorbingly pitch black, made of a heavy matte fabric that seemed to swallow the dim light from the distant festival stage. There were no bright stripes, no colorful checkerboard patterns, and no corporate sponsor logos painted on its sides. Instead, the only thing covering the massive nylon envelope was a single, giant, crudely painted white smiley face. In the daylight, it might have looked like a simple cartoon, but in the shivering darkness of the desert night, it looked deeply unsettling. The eyes were hollow, empty circles, and the wide, painted mouth stretched open in a frozen, manic grin that seemed to mock anyone who looked at it. Lily walked closer, her flashlight beam shaking slightly as it washed over the balloon. Standing perfectly still inside the woven basket was the pilot. He was dressed in a thick, old-fashioned leather aviator coat that looked stiff and stained with oil. His head was covered by a heavy, scratched leather pilot's mask and dark glass goggles, completely obscuring his facial features. He didn't turn his head, but Lily could feel his unseen gaze locked tightly onto her. Driven by a mix of professional duty and a growing icy sense of fear, Lily stepped over the security rope to investigate. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice trembling slightly over the howling wind. "This area is closed to the public, and your balloon isn't on the official launch grid. I need to see your registration permit." The pilot did not answer. He didn't move a single muscle. He just stood there like a lifelike mannequin, staring straight ahead through those dark, lifeless goggles. Lily took 3 more steps forward, bringing her flashlight right up to the edge of the basket. The moment the beam of light hit the woven material, her stomach dropped, and a wave of pure nausea washed over her. This basket wasn't made of normal, flexible willow branches or brown wicker. It was intricately and tightly woven out of hundreds of bleached, dried human bones. Rib cages formed the sturdy walls of the basket, long leg bones were lashed together to form the corners, and small, hollow human fingers were tied together to make the trim along the top edge. Before Lily could even open her mouth to scream, the silent pilot suddenly moved with terrifying, lightning-fast speed. He reached up and yanked the heavy metal burner chain. Instantly, the burner erupted with a furious, deafening roar, but the flame that shot upward wasn't the normal warm orange of propane. It was a brilliant, blinding, blood-red fire that cast a sickening crimson glow across the entire field. In that split second of intense red light, Lily looked up at the giant fabric envelope above her, and her breath caught in her throat. The crudely painted white smiley face was no longer static or flat. The fabric around the mouth began to pucker and wrinkle like real skin, and the painted lips twisted upward into a real, deep, monstrous grin. The hollow white eyes began to roll around inside the nylon, focusing down on Lily with an expression of pure, unadulterated malice. The nylon material itself began to ripple and bulge outward, as if hundreds of invisible faces were screaming and pushing against the inside of the balloon, desperate to break free. The terrible roar of the red burner didn't sound like burning gas anymore. It sounded like the synchronized, agonizing shrieks of 1,000 trapped souls wailing in pain. The wind around the black balloon suddenly whipped into a localized, violent frenzy, knocking Lily backward onto the hard dirt. She tried to scramble to her feet and run back toward the bright safety of the festival stage, but her legs felt heavy and paralyzed, as if the ground itself was holding her down. She watched in absolute horror as the pilot pulled the burner chain again and again, sending massive pulses of red fire into the living balloon. With a final, violent hiss, the heavy ropes holding the bone basket to the ground snapped with the sound of gunshots. The black balloon shot straight up into the night sky at an impossible, terrifying speed, defying the laws of physics. It didn't drift slowly like a normal balloon. It launched upwards like a rocket, leaving a trail of foul-smelling black smoke behind it. As it vanished into the dark storm clouds above, the wide, echoing laughter of the monstrous entity filled the air, vibrating through the ground and leaving Lily shivering on the dirt, staring up into the empty, silent night. Sam and Chloe wanted to escape the massive, suffocating crowds of the main festival park, so they drove their old pickup truck up a quiet, isolated dirt road a few miles away from the Albuquerque grounds. They parked on a high, rocky ridge overlooking the vast desert basin, a secret spot where they could watch the evening events in total peace. With a pair of heavy binoculars in hand, they sat comfortably in the bed of their truck, watching the beautiful, distant shapes of the hot air balloons float gracefully against the deep purple and orange hues of the New Mexico sunset. From this distance, the festival looked entirely serene, a silent dance of colorful lanterns suspended in the air. But as twilight quickly faded into the deep black of a desert night, the temperature dropped drastically, and a sudden, biting wind began to howl through the jagged canyons behind them. The air grew thick, bringing with it a strange metallic smell that smelled like burning electrical wires and ozone. Before they could decide to pack up their things and head home, Chloe pointed a trembling finger up at the sky. A rogue, neon green hot air balloon had separated from the main group, drifting rapidly away from the city lights and moving directly toward their isolated ridge. It was descending at a dangerous speed, swaying violently back and forth in the erratic wind until it hovered just 30 feet directly above their parked truck, completely blocking out the stars. The sheer size of it was overwhelming in the dark, a massive, pulsing dome of neon fabric that seemed to vibrate with a low, humming energy. Sam and Chloe froze, expecting to see a panicked pilot shouting down to them for help or throwing out a guide rope to secure a bumpy emergency landing on the rocky ground. Instead, the balloon's heavy metal burner gave a sudden, deafening whoosh that echoed off the canyon walls, but the flame that erupted from the nozzle was entirely wrong. It wasn't the bright, warm orange of burning propane. It was a freezing, ghostly blue fire that cast long, distorted shadows across the desert rocks. The flame shed absolutely no warmth. In fact, the moment the blue fire lit up, the air around the truck became instantly freezing, causing Sam and Chloe's breath to cloud heavily in the air. They looked up through the truck's glass sunroof into the basket, and their blood ran cold. The wicker basket was entirely empty. There were no propane tanks, no navigation instruments, and no human being at the controls. Yet the burner continued to cycle on and off, blasting its icy blue fire into the envelope as if operated by an invisible, mechanical ghost. Suddenly, a long, thick, frayed anchor rope dropped over the edge of the basket, swinging wildly beneath it like a pendulum. The heavy hemp rope slammed onto the roof of their truck with a loud thud and began to scrape violently across the metal, making a sickening sound that sounded exactly like sharp fingernails clawing at a chalkboard. "Get in the car now," Sam yelled, grabbing Chloe's arm and pulling her into the cab of the truck. They slammed the doors shut, locking out the freezing wind. Panicking, Sam jammed the key into the ignition and turned it, but the truck's engine didn't make a sound. The dashboard lights flickered twice and died completely. The battery was instantly and totally drained, leaving them trapped in the dark cab with no headlights and no heater. Above them, the cold blue fire from the balloon flared again, brighter and more furious than before. Through the glass sunroof, they could see that the neon green fabric of the balloon was no longer smooth. It was pulsing and contracting like a giant, living heart, drawing energy from the atmosphere. Suddenly, the swinging anchor rope whipped around the side of the truck like a striking snake, wrapping itself tightly around the steel door handle of the driver's side. With a violent, bone-jarring jerk, the balloon began to rise rapidly into the atmosphere. The heavy steel truck was ripped off the rocky ground, tilting dangerously as it was pulled up into the sky. Sam and Chloe screamed, clutching onto their seatbelts as the desert floor rapidly disappeared beneath them, leaving them suspended in a metal cage, flying higher and higher into the pitch-black, frozen clouds where the blue fire never stops burning.